This is Counterpoint, show number 105. Producer Brian Murray. Time 28:32. KWSU TV Pullman.
Welcome to Counterpoint for this Thursday, April 9th. This is the program that brings together a couple of people you well know and their opinions. From the Lewiston Morning Tribune, the editorial page editor and columnist, Bill Hall, who generally represents the liberal view. And on the conservative side, Doug Wilson, a Moscow minister and columnist with the Idahonian Daily News. I'm Glenn Johnson. I sit here right in the middle. We'll hear a commentary first of all, then a response, and later on in the program we'll hit the grab bag of current topics. First of all, here's Bill Hall.
Have you ever noticed that it is generally the dumbest men who assert the superiority of their own sex? It isn't the Nobel Prize winners or the university presidents, or least of all the newspaper columnists who try to place themselves above women. It is the dumb rednecks and the unsophisticated high school jocks and the narrow right-wing ministers who offer the bizarre theory that women are and ought to be inferior to men. It is men with the most reason to doubt their own competitive abilities who feel some need to keep the little flowers shackled to the pedestal where they won't be quite so much of a threat to incompetent men. Unfortunately, those men, coupled with the willing female doormats to which they frequently attach themselves, constitute a noisy political force. They are not numerous enough to be a majority, but they are loud enough to scare the testosterone out of that huge army of wimps who serve in the state legislatures of the land. And so, flying in the face of the majority wish in this nation and in the fact of female competence, the state legislators of America, on the eve of declaring women legally equal, suddenly cut and ran. They decided that they preferred re-election to justice. And now, with but 13 years left in the 20th century, we still don't have an equal rights amendment in the U.S. Constitution. We must get back to work on that before future historians poke any more fun at us than they are already likely to. The Equal Rights Amendment is, like finally granting the vote to women at the beginning of this century, not a question of whether, but a matter of when the inevitable step will be taken. Pray that the time will be the 20th century, not later when the women we care about are dead and gone and cheated of what could have been theirs in our lifetime. This is the era to end the rule of those poor, antiquated men who find their importance in subjugating not only the women in their own families, but the women in our families as well. We must make the national declaration in our time that our sisters and our daughters, our mothers and our wives are every bit as good as we are. Indeed, many are much better than those little Archie bunkers who would hold all women hostage on that patronizing pedestal, on that monument to macho by the dumbest men among us. Doug?
Bill, that was quite an oratorical display. I'm impressed by it, but I want to get beyond the philosophy of your statement.
A woman could have done as well.
Well, I would like to ask you a particular question. What rights specifically would the ERA grant that women don't already have? What do you want?
Well, as a matter of fact, it wouldn't grant a lot. It would clear up, it would give some legal foundation to some of the challenges of women who are trying to assert the right to become, trying to get promoted in the police force or something of that sort. But primarily it would be what I said in that wonderful oration, and that would be a national declaration of the worth of women.
Now, is the Constitution, which is a place where we're supposed to have our fundamental law, a place for philosophical declarations of that nature?
What is more fundamental than the legal equality of more than half the population?
Wait, what do you mean?
I'm surprised you gave me a straight line.
No,
like that.
what do you mean? Legal equality. I mean, do women not have the right to keep and bear arms right now? Do they not have the right to vote right now?
They don't have the right to...
Does habeas corpus not apply to them right now?
They, as a matter of fact, some of what they lack is the opportunity to go get their rear end shot off the way you and I had when we were that age. I believe women should be made, they should be hauled down off the pedestal, and they should be treated equally in all ways. They should be given a chance to become presidents of universities. They should be given a chance to get drafted. They should be given a chance to pay their dues and to...
Now, my question is this. I would like you to specifically state, well, first, if you have specifics in mind, why don't you put those specifics into the amendment so that we all know what we're talking about?
Let me quote a lawyer named Al Durr, who took a case to the U.S. Supreme Court winning the right on one point of law for women. He said, don't ever let some ding-a-ling tell you that all the laws have been cleared up, or that we can do them one at a time. He said, we can in one fell swoop tidy up all these state legislative laws around the country with the Equal Rights Amendment.
But if, for example, you...
I can't name you all of them because there are probably 2,000 in Alabama alone.
No, I'm not talking about the laws that would be struck down. I'm talking about the ramifications from the ERA that are unspecified. In other words, when we had the amendment to the Constitution that gave women the right to vote, everybody knew, voting for and against, what right we were specifically talking about. Now, I have no idea what some bizarre federal judge is going to do with the ERA. Is he going to ban father-son banquets for the Boy Scouts? What is he going to do with it?
He's going to do, it is not what he is going to do, it is what this society through its judges, not one judge, is going to do. And what this society is going to do is what it has always done, and that is practice common sense. The judge does not want his mother tinkling in the bathroom next to the men, and he's not going to permit that.
Wait a second. You can't suck and blow in the same breath. You can't say absolute equality and then turn around and say, well, of course, there's going to be distinctions.
We're not. I never said absolute equality. You said absolute equality.
Well,
I'm saying that you will have legal equality and.
But does legal equality apply to private universities, private institutions?
I certainly hope so.
Okay.
Legal equality is.
So what barriers are left? You said that women will be serving in combat right alongside the men. If that's the case, what could be left?
Well, what could be left is dozens, and in some cases hundreds of statutes in the states of the United States across the land.
The statutes which would be declared unconstitutional, right?
Yes.
By the ERA. So those things would fall. Now,
First of all, they would be declared unconstitutional by the courts. They'd be declared unconstitutional by the Constitution, and then they could be challenged in the opposite direction in courts. The burden of proof would be on people like you.
Okay, so so what you're saying, basically, is that you don't know what the particular ramifications of the ERA would be.
I don't know what the particular ramifications in detail of any law or constitutional amendment are. I know what the ramifications of our legal system are, and that's a great deal of common sense. The courts of this land are obviously going to maintain that which makes sense in our sexual differences.
Wait a second. You can't...
The law, the Constitution...
You can't say that our common sense will protect us when you, in violation of common sense, are advocating something like the ERA.
Well, common sense would dictate we get off this one. It's time now for Doug Wilson to have his turn at his commentary. Doug?
I have a question. What country lies between us and the political turmoil in Central America? I have another question. Why do liberals insist on pretending that Mexico, the answer to question number one, is a political rock as solid as the British Empire of Queen Victoria? I don't know. It baffles me too. Perhaps they do this to avoid facing up to the political reality just to the south of Mexico. Things are going on down there that the liberal would rather not think about. It certainly can't have anything to do with the stability of Mexico. Does the liberal believe that Mexico cannot experience communist revolution because they have a thriving economy? But Mexico's economy is a train wreck. Does he think that revolution cannot spread to Mexico because Mexico has a robust political system? But Mexico, her name is corruption. What's the deal? Why do liberals think that Mexico presents no danger? If we think we have a refugee problem now, just wait till after the fighting starts. I would like to make some TV history here. I would like to get a bona fide liberal, which Bill certainly is, to publicly state the latitude line past which it is permissible to start fighting communists. Where's the line, Bill? And how far is it from the Rio Grande?
Well, once again, I'm being asked to represent a liberal position that exists only in your fuzzy little head. I can only speak for this liberal. I am of the impression that some real trouble for the United States could be brewing, perhaps is brewing, in Mexico. I've also noticed that about once every 2 years, whether it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House, we send a president down there to pretend to be paying a little bit of attention to the Mexicans. And we have dinner or something, and we salute them. And then we go back to paying attention to France and Great Britain. If we would pay as much attention and as much respect to the Mexicans and the Mexican government day in and day out as we do people half a world away, we would face a lot less trouble down there.
Wait a second. Is our respect that we give to Mexico, is that independent of any facts? I mean, there's a reason for respecting Great Britain's political system. It's respectable. But Mexico is corrupt through and through. If we pay attention to Mexico, we're going to be horrified at what we
Well,
find.
I'm glad to hear that corruption of an administration is enough to turn you against it. We could go down the list of countries in South America and see which ones you support and which ones you don't. You see, the difference between you and me, Doug Wilson, is that you don't mind supporting a country if it's corrupt. I don't like the corruption in Mexico. I don't necessarily support the present Mexican government. I certainly don't support the corruption in its police force.
Okay, now...
But you think a little bit of corruption, you and your kind think a little bit of corruption is terrific so long as it kisses Uncle Sam's behind once in a while and pretends to be our friend.
Well, that's a nice straw man. You've said that I don't mind corruption when I, in fact, do, and I mind it whether it's left-wing and totalitarian or right-wing and authoritarian. So that's a straw man. But I'd like to point out that you didn't answer the question.
You were against Taiwan, the Taiwan government then?
No, what I think we ought to do is with authoritarian governments that have elements of corruption in them or are corrupt, we have a leverage, and we should work and use our leverage to do something about the corruption. We should have done it with the Shah of Iran. We should have done it with Somoza. We should have done it with Batista. And had we exercised our influence the way we should have, we wouldn't be facing a far worse threat from Castro and from Ortega and the revolution in Central America.
From the Contras, speaking of corruption.
So that is granted. I just want to point out that you didn't answer the question. At what point does it become permissible to say, hey, listen, we're not going to negotiate with these fellows anymore. It's time to defend our borders?
Well, first of all, I would speak most of the time to most governments, be they left or be they right. But let's get one thing clear. You're trying to cast me in the role of a defender of Ortega. I am a defender neither of Ortega, nor of his predecessor, least of all, nor of what is likely to succeed him. If I had to choose between Ortega and his predecessor, and between those thugs trying to replace Ortega, I guess I would choose Cory Aquino or Ronald Reagan. But if I were a Nicaraguan and didn't have the luxury of living under a Ronald Reagan or a Jimmy Carter or whomever, I think maybe I'd prefer an Ortega, to tell you the truth, but I don't have to choose that, and I don't have to like Ortega, and I don't.
You mistake my purpose. What I'm trying to do is to get you to say something reasonable in public. What I want you to do is...
things I won't do in public.
You're the president. You're the president. Mexico has just fallen to a communist government. There's a communist government now in Mexico. You're the president. Do you send in the Marines?
No, I send in the Peace Corps. That'd be more vicious than the Marines. I would do what Jimmy Carter did originally in Nicaragua. I would try to make love, not war. I would do what Harry Truman said he would have done in Cuba had he been in and not Eisenhower.
Okay, now what...
He said he would have gone to Castro and said, now you've had yourself a nice little revolution down there. Good, that was a bad guy you threw out. You're going to have to go to one place or the other. The Russians or us for the money. Why don't you come to us? Why don't you come up there and talk about it?
That's exactly what Jimmy Carter did with Nicaragua, and it didn't work.
It didn't work because the Nicaraguans got snotty with us, and we got our feelings hurt and went home. We should have kept trying. It's just like courting anyone else.
Okay, now, so in answer to my question, you're not going to send in the Marines south of the Rio Grande.
I'm not going to send in the Marines north of the American border. I'm going to send in the Marines when American interests are directly threatened.
No, all right, no, that's my question. What do you consider to be a direct threat? New Mexico lost, Arizona lost? What's a direct threat?
I consider New Mexico lost, Arizona lost a direct threat. I consider troops massing on the Mexican border a direct threat. I consider your delusions not a direct threat.
So thinking ahead is something you're apparently avoiding.
Oh, no, I think ahead all the time. I just think ahead to things that are so, not to things that ain't.
Okay, now when Cuba fell, and we were saying we got to do something about Cuba or it's going to spread in Central America. No, it's just Cuba. But now here it is in Nicaragua.
Well, I don't recall that we said all of that.
Well, there were people said, oh, you know.
I think I was
same
about
things
15,
were said about,
and you were the gleam in mother's eye. I don't recall.
The same sort of things were said about Castro that are now being said about Ortega. The same delusions, the same belief that negotiations
there's some
solve
truth
everything.
to that, as a matter of fact. And I have the genuine question of, did Castro turn toward the left element in his own operation because we were pressuring him so hard, or because he was naturally inclined? Is Ortega closing down one civil right after another because we have made him paranoid, or because he was that way? I suspect it's a little bit of both. He's not a born Democrat.
Well, he's certainly not, but he's not just changing things within Nicaragua. He's trying to export.
You know, it's just like the United States and the Soviet Union. It's a little better lately, but they used to be threatening each other all the time, and they became more paranoid, more nasty towards each other. I think we've made Ortega more nasty toward us than need be.
Now, do you believe that there is any international crisis or incident threatening the security of the United States which is better solved by military force rather than diplomatic means?
Yes, on occasion.
On occasion, okay, but troops on, but it has to be troops on the Rio Grande before you see
No,
it.
not necessarily. I mean, if it's Russian missiles poised and ready to strike, then I guess we go for broke. I don't know. These are games you like to play.
It's time now to hit the grab bag of current topics. And if you would like to drop a suggestion to us, have Bill and Doug talk about, you can send it to Counterpoint, KWSU TV, Murrow Communications Center, Pullman, Washington, 99164. We got one from a viewer from Walla Walla, Washington, Richard Shropshire, who writes in, Bill, this will go to you. How is it that the Democratic Party has foreign policy goals that more nearly parallel those in the Soviets in Central America than those of their own country? Who do Senators Pell and Dodd, and for that matter, Representative Foley, really represent?
Well, what a pejorative question. I don't think I can answer for such a large and diverse group as Senators Pell and Dodd and Representative Foley. I'm more familiar with Representative Foley's position. I think it's somewhat near that of the middle ground of the American people. It's one that we shouldn't rush off to another Vietnam. I've heard Foley talk on this within the last 6 months. He does not agree with Senator Dodd. If I understand Senator Dodd, he's pretty extreme on this question. And it's a little bit of name-calling to suggest that people who offer an opinion in the Congress are siding with the Russians or something like that. I thought we were over that in the 1950s.
Well, am I to take that to mean that you think the Soviets have no wishes about how things go in Central America? They have no concerns?
I think they're as ambitious and as big a bunch of Budinskis as we are.
So
I think the world would be a lot better off if the Russians and the Americans and people like the gentleman who wrote this question and Senator Dodd
Okay, very good. You heard it first here.
Would come back home and worry about a few little problems we have here instead of running off to Central America and trying to get a war started between this dictatorship and that dictatorship.
I'll simply point out that the Soviets do have a foreign policy objective in Central America. They'd be stupid if they didn't. And there is a wing in Congress, there is a sector of the representatives and senators there in Congress that are more in tune with the Soviets' objectives than they are with America's interests. And I think that's the intent of the question. I think it's a good one.
I think that's slander.
Okay, we'll move from there and we'll go to Doug on this one. Governor Booth Gardner says Washington's biggest problem right now is what he calls the brain drain, losing the state's educators to higher paying states. Gardner plans a $500 million hike in state aid to public schools and colleges. This will cause taxes to rise. Is the brain drain that big a problem? Are teachers worth that much money?
The brain drain may be a problem, but the last thing you want to do to fix it is to give public schools more money. The last thing public schools need is more money. I can't give you figures for Washington, but I'm sure they're higher than Idaho's. In Idaho, the government schools get approximately $260 a month per child. Private schools could do twice as good a job with half the money. Public schools have
half the brains.
At least we graduate kids that read, instead of the estimated 20% of graduates from public high schools in America not being functionally literate.
Well, that's we is your school. I'll concede your school, but some of these schools are better than others, and you do get some natural selection involved in the choice of your students too.
But we do a better job with half the money, and the thing that's important is, you've probably seen that bumper sticker, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Well, the response to that is we did, and now it wants a raise. They can't graduate kids who read, or they can't graduate all kids who read, and now they want more money to continue to do a poor job.
Well, from my perspective, sitting over in one of the most poverty-stricken states in the nation, I still see where the public school teachers of Washington could do with more money. I suppose in terms of competitiveness, higher education salaries are low in Washington, but I think nationally, by comparison with other honest, hard-working, competent people, higher education salaries nationally are getting out of hand.
Here's one, Bill.
If I may interrupt,
Okay,
I would like to see the day come when we pay a first-grade teacher more than a professor of English literature in this country.
Incidentally, I don't have a problem with paying the teachers more. The problem is that the government schools, being bureaucracies, chew up all that money in bureaucratic shuffling. There's no excuse for the poor job they're doing, given the amount of money they're already getting. I think more of it ought to get to the teachers, and I don't have a problem with that.
They have to give you your entertainment by your football team, but these other things that taxpayers insist on.
But the teachers ought to be required to teach.
I thought they were.
We'll get back to this one. Former Secretary of State Alexander Haig has announced he's running for the Republican presidential nomination. Being as how Haig has never held an elective office, how can he be qualified for the job, Bill?
Well, when you say Alexander Haig, I'm inclined to doze off a bit. But he is qualified for the job at a technical level. He was president of the United States at one time. I am told that in the final weeks and months of the Richard Nixon administration, that he was really more in charge than anyone else. That Nixon was totally diverted by Watergate and coping with that, and that Alexander Haig was very much in charge of the government at that time. So he's qualified at a technical management level. He has the experience. Whether he has the vision remains to be seen in the campaign.
Now, it's not going to go anywhere. One of his main problems is he cannot communicate. He cannot communicate any kind of a vision to the American people, and he's going to have to convince them of his ability, and he doesn't have that ability. He has been apparently able to convince particular power brokers that he's a man of ability, and I think he is, but he's just not a good communicator, and you're not going to get anywhere unless
he did say one thing today that I thought was rather wise. He said he believed leadership in the presidency required that you recognize that the people who get you elected aren't necessarily the people you want to help you run the government. That may have been a little biased because he, as one hired to run the government, was probably fighting with some political appointees, but nonetheless there's a lot of truth to that. It's two different mindsets, warring for the presidency, for the office, and buckling down to boring day-to-day management.
Doug, the scandal at Southern Methodist University has raised questions concerning the ethics involved in college athletics. Is there too much pressure being put on universities to achieve athletically? And is the phrase student-athlete a contradiction in terms?
The phrase student-athlete is not a contradiction in terms, but you do have a lot of associations, alumni associations, that are much more interested in what kind of season the basketball team had or the football team had than they are at the technical competence or academic competence of the graduates of that particular school, and that is unfortunate. But the problem, as the question hinted at, the problem must be solved by an ethical approach to it, not by a government approach to it.
I blame most of all the alumni and the gridiron clubs especially, who put all this pressure on this win at any cost, win at the price of diverting money from the engineering department to athletics. This was done on this shameless campus. They put that kind of pressure on university presidents, and I blame the university presidents second of all. They're the ones who get that pressure, but they're the ones charged most of all with running an institution of enlightenment and not turning it over totally to circuses. We have to have a little bit of fun now and then, but these multi-million-dollar athletic programs go way beyond fun. And but I blame these university presidents especially because every time there's a football coach gets his nose in a ringer, they slap his hands. They're afraid to trifle with the football coach. On most campuses, not necessarily including this one at this point, a winning football coach, a winning basketball coach has more power than the president. And until we find some way to change that, most of these presidents are going to be lapdogs of the athletic department. So other than that, I have no opinion.
This firing line special is made possible by major grants from American General Corporation.
Insurance.
Good evening, and welcome to Counterpoint for Thursday, January 14th. This is the program that brings together a couple of people you know. Bill Hall, the editorial page editor of the Lewiston Morning Tribune, who generally represents the liberal point of view. And on the conservative side, Doug Wilson, a Moscow minister who also writes for the Lewiston Morning Tribune. And I'm Glenn Johnson. In a moment, we'll go to the grab bag of current topics, but first of all, here's a commentary by Bill Hall.
I was sitting at a dinner table the other day with several intelligent, educated, and generally well-read liberals when one of them said a typically stupid liberal thing. Well, what I can't understand, he said, is why the press doesn't complain about the fact Ronald Reagan hardly ever holds a press conference. And several of the other liberals at the table all murmured and clucked and shook their heads in that haughty way liberals have of fretting over the wicked Reagan-loving press. What's intriguing about this, of course, is that it ain't so. I think every White House reporter and every newspaper in America, most certainly including my own, has fussed and fumed in print and otherwise that Mr. Reagan's managers have hidden him from press conferences. And small wonder. As Ronald Reagan, his presidency, and his marbles fade into the sunset, his managers and his missus trust him less and less in that format. But how could anyone, even a chest-pounding liberal, get the impression that the press had been anywhere close to silent on the subject of Mr. Reagan's well-advised fear of formal press conferences? The editorial columns and the airwaves have been brimming over with cranky complaints for several years now. Liberals get that impression from the same paranoid corners of the mind as those conservatives who imagine that the press picks on the president. They get it from a compulsion to humor their own immature need for political devils. They believe their own delusions on the subject. They filter out the very facts carried in their own daily newspapers that they say the press should be reporting. The press doesn't rake Ronald Reagan over the coals every second, say the liberals, thus the press is protecting him. The press doesn't kiss his feet, say the conservatives, thus the press is picking on him. It was ever thus. If the press plays it down the middle, reporting president's warts, halos and all, the president's right-wing defenders accuse the press of bias, and so do the president's left-wing detractors. The press isn't biased for or against presidents, but many a presidential worshiper and hater is biased against the press. Doug, when are you left and right-wing zealots going to stop picking on all those innocent reporters?
The thing that's interesting about what you just said is that you said liberals object to the press for treating Ronald Reagan lightly, and then you go to demonstrate that the press hasn't treated him lightly at all, and then you try to put conservative critics of the press in the same category when they say that the press hasn't treated Ronald Reagan lightly at all. Seems to me that you're trying to have it both ways, and you can't.
Well, let's give everyone a little
journalism. I mean, who's right?
Let's give everyone a little journalism lesson, most especially you who need it most. First of all, there are the news columns, and then there are the editorial columns. In the editorial columns and in the personal face-to-face relationship between White House reporters and the White House personnel, they have screamed bloody murder about this failure to hold a press conference. In the news columns, they have just merely reported the presidential day-to-day work. And how would you like to be in my shoes? You just report the White House, what's going on your front page in the news columns where it belongs, and if his boots aren't licked, you people get all upset and say that's bias, and if every nit isn't picked, the liberals come unglued.
No, the problem is more fundamental than that. The problem has to do with...
the fundamentalists do it too.
Well, that's a separate question. The problem is fundamental. It's not what is said or not said. It is what is assumed, okay?
Assumed, boy, you're right about that.
What is assumed by the reporters in their news stories when you'd have to be, I think, blind to the facts not to realize that broadcast journalists and print journalists are overwhelmingly liberal in their opinions. You'd also have to be blind.
Management overwhelmingly conservative.
Well, the management doesn't write the stories.
They hire the people.
The people that write the stories are overwhelmingly liberal, and you'd have to be blind to the facts to deny that that bias doesn't come out in the news stories.
You know what really bugs me about you and you liberals too, is that I'm always having someone say to me, as you said in your column last Saturday morning, why doesn't the press do thus and such when I've read the stories myself? Where did you learn this information on Gaddafi? Do you have some pipeline to his press service? I read it in the Associated Press. I saw it on network television. It's been reported that he's been awfully quiet since Ronnie bombed him.
This is the thing.
You can't read anything you don't agree with. You just go blank when you see something you agree with.
There are, one, alternative sources of news that have sprung up because of this liberal bias in the press.
Alternative editorial writing services.
And secondly, just because the press reports something once that ought to be talked about for weeks doesn't mean they've eliminated the bias. There are some things that are so overwhelmingly obvious that a liberal slanted press will report on. That doesn't mean they give it the weight that ought to be given to it. The fact remains that when you see Sam Donaldson talking to the president, he's acting like he's the Speaker of the House. He's acting like he's the leader of an opposing party, and he isn't.
He's acting like a prosecuting attorney in an
That's right.
adversary system, doing his job, and many
the
a
press-
conservative reporter asked a liberal question and vice versa. I've done it myself.
The press is
It's their
not...
job to play the devil's advocate. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say devil.
No,
in front of you.
the press's job is to collect the news. The press's
That's
job...
how you collect the news, by
No, that's how
jabbing
you-
politicians who
that's
don't
how
want to
you-
say,
No, that's not how you
want to
collect...
hide stuff from us.
That's not how you collect the
What
news.
you wanna
That's
do
how
is
you
pass
make
out-
the news.
you wanna
Sam
pass out press-
Donaldson's trying to make the news at these press conferences. They're trying to make the news. They're not trying to report the news and collect it. They are trying to usurp the position of the party of opposition.
He's
the
trying to get the-
Democrats ought to be doing that. The Democrats ought to be asking the president the questions that Sam Donaldson is. And anybody who can look at Sam Donaldson and say that he isn't biased is blind.
Well, now, wait a minute. The Republican National Chairman and the Democratic National Chairman aren't the only ones who can ask tough questions of a president. Somebody's got to do it, and Sam Donaldson's a lot better trained for it than partisans and then you right and left-wing extremists. By the way, I'm not talking about ordinary sane liberals and ordinary sane conservatives. I'm talking about the sort of people who say, why doesn't the press do what the press has already done, such as you did last Saturday and such as my seatmate did at dinner the other day?
Now we'll turn to Doug Wilson for his commentary.
The Israelis have a problem on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. The Israelis also have a problem in the rest of the world. Apart from the rights and wrongs of the Palestinian question, the Israelis have lost one of their major assets, which is the international perception of them as an underdog. In the West, our failure to understand the situation there can be summed up in two words: religious ignorance. So long as we continue to address it as a cultural clash involving territory, we will continue to be part of the problem. Zionism is a religious movement based on a misunderstanding of the Old Testament prophecies. On the Christian front, a similar misunderstanding called dispensationalism has resulted in widespread support for Israel no matter what they do. This Jewish movement, supported by Christians, has resulted in a major collision with the Muslims in Palestine. The fact that many of these Muslims have resorted to terrorism hasn't helped much. In the meantime, our media continues with the facile assumption that religious questions should be relegated to the potluck page of the newspaper. It is no wonder that no one seems to know what is going on. Bill, is your newspaper going to do something about this?
Well, the religion is replete throughout this news story, which is on page 1 of the Tribune twice a week, unfortunately, which means it's a serious development in the world. I'm reminded, though, in agreeing with you to some extent on this, that everyone would be better off in that part of the world, especially including the Israelis, if they gave up the belief, the fact, I don't care what you want to call it, that the Bible is a deed rather than a history book. If you look at it as a history of where people have been in that part of the world over the centuries, then you are stuck with these enmities eternally, and children will die, and their children will die, and children after that. The Jews and the Arabs, the Muslims, will never be out of this thicket until they say, enough, we will put aside yesterday's hurts, and we will go on from here. But this get even, generation after generation on both sides, is what prolongs this. And yes, that is fired by one of the most poisonous influences on earth, which is religion.
I want to point out that what you're saying is, in order for peace to come to the Middle East, devout Jews, all they have to do is give up their Judaism.
Well, if they have to give up a portion of their Judaism, they have to think on that, whether they're better off that way, just as the LDS church leaders had to think on whether giving up white supremacy was in the best long-range interest of their people. I think it's about time that somebody in Jewish leadership had a revelation on that score for the sake of his own people.
Do you admit that the religious discussion in our media generally contents itself with names? In other words, you have Jews and Muslims, and the average person in America reading these news stories, the average reader of these news stories has no idea of the doctrinal differences.
The news stories
resulting in these
the news stories in the daily press are superficial on the religious aspect of this, what makes it possible. Public television, with more time on some of these subjects, does a better job. The magazines do a better job. But in that realm, if I may recommend a good book that taught me a lot about that part of the world and led me to the opinion I just uttered on ending these enmities. The Source by James Michener is a fine, palatable short course on comparative religions in that part of the world. You read The Source, and when a Jew says to you or an Arab says to you, they started this, you will laugh. I mean, that's been lost. First, the Jews were bloody, and then the Muslims were bloody, and then the Christians kicked hell out of everybody in there for a while. Nobody's hands are clean there. And when you start placing blame, let's agree that everyone is to blame and worry about who is not to blame from this generation on.
The fact that people are saying they started and they started, that's not the religious question. That's simply how people react in a conflict, just blaming the other person for starting it. The religious question has to do with things like how do you interpret scriptures? The Muslims interpret it one way, the Jews another, Christians another.
Some of the Muslims interpret it violently, and some Muslims do not.
Well, no,
There's the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is quite a violent old devil.
No,
but,
look, the point is that a typical Western secularist...
Thank God Christians don't come up with different interpretations of their religion and its deathly meanings.
Just imagine the typical Western secularist who looks at this carnage, or religious carnage anywhere, whether it's Ireland or the Middle East, and he says, not understanding religious issues at all, says, why don't you guys just give up these things and live at peace with one another, indicating and displaying his ignorance of the issues involved. That doesn't mean that these people are right to be doing what they're doing. It's simply to say that if we are going to be part of the solution, we have to understand what motivates and drives them. Not one person in 1,000 understands what drives the fundamentalist Muslims in Iran. They don't understand what drives the Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, there is a political consideration here that you should understand, certainly, and that's that there is one difference between the Jews and all of the countries surrounding them, and that is that it is a democracy with police state tendencies in the Gaza Strip. I think you're right, they're their own worst enemies on that. Shamir is nuts. But nonetheless, that is a democracy of people that has been standing up against a bunch of police states around them. Golda Meir once said a wise thing. She said, you can tell whether a country is a democracy or a police state by answering the question, are the opposition members of parliament in the parliament or in jail? And so there's a great appeal in America. We wish Israel well, and I think we should wish Israel well, but they're in a little bit of a Vietnam situation now. Our friends, the Canadians, almost despaired of our stupidity during that period, and I almost despair of what I see happening on the West Bank now.
The Canadians...
But I'm still a friend.
The Canadians despairing of the United States during Vietnam has very little to do with our attitude toward Israel now.
Thank you, Rabbi. I know you loved that war, too.
Well, no, I think it was an immoral war, but...
We were putting little brown people in their place,
no,
too.
I mean, it was an immoral war.
There's some racism in what Israel's doing now, and there was racism in
that was an immoral war because we didn't win it. But it is also...
Morality is decided by who kills the other person.
No, it is also a separate subject. Morality in war means that you don't go into...
No, it's not.
Wait a second. Morality in war means fundamentally you don't go in, fight a war for 10 years, kill thousands and thousands of people and accomplish exactly nothing. That is fundamentally immoral, and it was a dumb thing for us to do. But the Canadians' objection to that was a separate thing than what we're talking about now, which is Israel. Israel is a Western nation. It has a lot in common with us. We have, therefore, more sympathy extended toward them, and properly so.
Right.
But that doesn't change the fact that Israel exists as a nation because of a religious impulse that people don't understand.
Well, I'll tell you what's astonishing about Vietnam, or what makes Vietnam and this situation very similar, is that it is astonishing that Israel and the United States are involved in something like this. There's nothing astonishing about the Soviet Union trying to run roughshod over Afghanistan in a rather racist way. It is astonishing when a basically decent people like the Americans and the Israelis stumble into something that is hurting innocent people by the thousands. That is what wraps these two together. It is the admirable nature of those people. There's nothing amazing about a villain becoming villainous.
Look, I refuse to accept you labeling our intervention in Vietnam as racist.
Well, I know you do.
What was racist was saying that, well, they're just Orientals. They don't mind being tyrannized by communism. They don't mind being forced onto boats and sent out to the ocean to die.
That's
the racism.
You've just made your own point, and that's that there's more harm in the world caused by ignorance than by anything else.
That's true enough.
Time now to go to our grab bag of current topics. This first question goes to Doug. That's a political question, Doug. Some say the Republicans are down now to Bush and Dole, and some even go a little bit further and say it's just down to Dole. How do you view the GOP contenders for president now?
I think that George Bush is in big trouble. I don't think he's going to get the nomination. I think the real race is going to wind up being between Dole and Kemp. I think Haig's going to drop out early, DuPont's going to drop out early, and Bush is going to go down fairly early considering his position, but I think he's going to be in grave difficulty. Robertson has enough money and enough committed followers to go all the way to the convention. I think he's going to wind up throwing in with Kemp, making some deal either for platform or some kind of platform deal or running ticket deal with Kemp in order to fight Dole. So I think the real race is going to be between Dole and Kemp as soon as George Bush is taken out of the picture.
I agree with most of what you said, but once again, there are notable exceptions. I never did think Bush would go all the way. For one thing, he's a front runner. For one thing, he's kind of stuffy. He has image problems. For one thing, he has to defend the president, and at this stage in a president's administration, it is only the negative things that one is asked about most often. So I didn't ever think he had the staying power, but I must admit he's done better than I thought he would so far. He's hasn't done well this week on his Iran-gate problems, which is congenital, I suppose.
That's what I think is going to take him out.
But he has done much better on the debates than I think anyone else. He stood up good and strong on that. I still think Dole might be the one who comes out of this. The main reason I discount Kemp is for part of the reason you discount Bush. Image, personality. Kemp is about as interesting as that ugly wallboard we use on this set. He's a very flat, dull personality.
He's only flat and dull to you because he talks sense.
Well, he talks sense to those who hear entirely out of their right ear and like to pore over obscure journals. I'm not disputing that he's a bright, though narrow and distorted man, but he does. But he is just not. He's not Mr. Excitement. Now let's face it. He's pretty good with a football in his hand, but with a dry lecture in his mouth, it's snore time.
Well, let's now take a look at the Democrats, Bill. Is there anybody that's Mr. Excitement in the Democratic?
There certainly isn't, not at this point. I suppose the most exciting presidential candidate on the scene in America today is Gorbachev, and I guess he's probably not available. He's the best politician in the lot so far. But I still...
He'll probably line up pretty well with some factions of the Democratic Party, too.
Yeah, well, I would still like...
He has a real constituency there.
Well, I don't know about that. He enjoys beating up on people in small countries, and that gives you more in common with good Christians like Robertson. I agree with you, however, that Robertson will stick around until the convention, the same way Jesse Jackson always sticks around out of over-preening immodesty, but he will bring some of those strange folks into the convention and be a factor in perhaps deciding a Secretary of State or maybe the vice presidential nomination. He won't get it, but he might be able to push it toward good old dull Jack Kemp or someone.
There are two things to watch out for with the Democrats. One is the people who aren't running, the Cuomos and the Bradleys and Nunns. That's one thing. These people, if anything gets deadlocked, could easily be persuaded to enter the race. The second thing is, because Gary Hart has come back in with no chance of winning, but enough name recognition and residual support to really foul things up, look for that to help out an underdog like Gore. And Gore, I think, is going to do well in the South on Super Tuesday.
Could it be he's testing the moral climate for Ted Kennedy?
No, I think that's water under the bridge, so to speak. But I agree with Cuomo. What will probably happen, partly through your Gary Hart scenario, is that somebody in Iowa and in New Hampshire will come in second to Gary Hart, maybe even first in New Hampshire. And then we folks in the press will give him all sorts of headlines. It's a name identification problem for most of these politics. There's more elections settled early at the presidential level and all the way through at the community level by name familiarity than any other factor. If your name is out, people aren't very careful. They'll vote for the name of a stupid person they've heard of over a bright person they've never heard of.
Ah, that's democracy.
Yeah, they won't take
Now,
a...
David Broder, the Washington Post, said, take a look at our own congressman from this particular area, Tom Foley, who's a leader in Congress, and said that he could be a potential candidate in view of the fact the Democrats can't seem to get together. Do you think he's a viable candidate?
No. The only way something like that would happen would be if he were, if the Republicans went into a convention deadlock, then they might look for somebody like that. I see the appeal.
If the Democrats went in deadlock?
I beg your...
Or the Republicans? You mean if the Democrats went in deadlocked, Foley might be possible?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I beg your pardon. Yeah, because Foley is kind of, he's from the middle. He's a centrist, and he also is a person who gets along well with Bob Dole.
You're going to have to
Ronald
stop
Reagan.
defining centrists in terms of where you are.
Well, I
That's
define it
a
only in terms
fundamental
of
mistake.
where most Americans are. I can see that it's not within your realm. But Tom Foley's one of the personalities in Congress that brings about compromise. He is one of the people who affects compromises, and he is well liked by right-wing Republicans. I challenge you to check that with Jack Kemp, and as a lot of firebrand liberal Democrats are not in that body. And so this might be the sort of person who would be appealing to a convention that is being torn apart. Bring in everybody's second choice. I can see that as personality. But he belongs where he is, where he's just probably 5 years away from being Speaker of the House. And he knows that. He's not going to give that up for some fairy tale presidential campaign.
Okay, Doug, this one here goes to you, since we gave Bill a chance on the Democrats.
All
He
right.
immediately went to the Republicans. Because of the stock market crash and the state's sluggish economy, political experts see the outlook for the 1988 Washington State Legislature as a grim one. They say there's not enough money to initiate new programs, many issues we put on hold. Do you seem to agree with that?
Well, yeah, I agree with that. If you can't have money, at the state level, you can't spend money you don't have. At the federal level, that's not a constraint yet. It will be if we get a balanced budget amendment. But at the state level, people really are restrained by lack of money. Where I differ is in thinking that this is a good thing. I think we need far fewer programs from our governments, federal and state governments and city governments and county governments. The fewer programs right now, the better. So I'm kind of glad they're running out of money.
Bill, any comments?
Well, you say right now, you always believe the fewer programs, the better. Some programs make sense sometimes, some make sense other times, and some in some areas, and some not in other areas. But I was intrigued that, I wonder what you think of what the president said this week, that this foreign, the fact we have more money leaving the country than coming in, the foreign trade deficit. There, I found it.
I'm glad you asked that, Bill.
He thinks that's really a benefit.
The foreign trade deficit is one of the non-issues. What happens is the Japanese send us all these cars and VCRs and things that do stuff, and we send them little green pieces of paper with presidents' pictures on them, and I think that's fine.
So you agree with the president that this huge deficit isn't really a problem, that it's
I think
an
that
asset?
the budget deficit is a genuine problem. The trade deficit is simply figures on paper indicating that the Japanese are sending goods into our country at a faster rate than we're sending goods out of it. Just imagine in a household in America, husband sits down to talk with his wife about their budget, and he says, honey, we've got to do something about this horrible trade deficit. We keep accumulating more and more stuff, and we don't send out nearly as much as we take in. And try and convince them that that's a problem. It's not a problem.
Well, you conservatives keep equating government with business, which isn't quite the same thing, and government with households. It just doesn't quite work that way. It's three separate entities. You can't compare them straight across to Doug Wilson's household, least of all to Doug Wilson's household.
Well, let's talk about another spending thing. The Air Force got approval bill from Congress to spend about $7.5 million on brown leather bomber jackets for its flight crew. The Air Force says they hope the jackets will keep good pilots and crew members in the military. Is this what it takes for the United States to recruit people to the military?
Well, frankly, yes. I think a few little doodads are the principal appeal of the military, all those toys, those planes, those jackets, that sort of thing. I don't mind that sort of thing so much, especially for the guys in the ranks and the guys in the cockpits. What I mind is that the civilian government isn't the only bloated bureaucracy in Washington. You have something like 75 admirals with chauffeurs. Well, what's going on there? You have these golf courses all over Washington for the Pentagon brass. And I was just reading today that you have the military pretty much in control of some of the assistant military officers, pretty much the bosses of several civilian undersecretaries of defense. That's certainly topsy-turvy.
That's true enough, and I think we agree there. Those sorts of perks for the average military officer or enlisted man is not that's not where the problem is. The problem is in the general procurement,
the bidding
policies in general for the major big-ticket items, which need to be tightened up a lot. We need all the hardware we're currently working on and more, but we need to tighten up severely how we go about getting these weapon systems.
Okay, Doug, this question for you. The rapid spread of AIDS and the fear it's caused throughout America. Universities are putting condoms in vending machines on campus. Washington State University just approved a plan to put condom vending machines in dormitories. University officials feel this will decrease the spread of AIDS. Will condoms that are easily available stop the spread of AIDS, or will it promote more sexual promiscuity?
It will not stop the spread of AIDS, and even if it did, it would not be a good idea. What we need to do is recognize that behavior has consequences. You can't indulge yourself on a society-wide basis in an orgy of self-indulgence and not expect the consequences to come back on you. The consequences are coming back on us, and everybody wants to have any solution, millions of dollars, condom machines, anything but a change in lifestyle. Until we learn that this problem is caused fundamentally by a certain type of sexual immorality, we're not going to make any strides at all. It's like that's like Time magazine running a cover story and saying, what are we going to do about lung cancer and the problem of coal miners? Now, some coal miners do get lung cancer and some hemophiliacs do get AIDS, but that's not where the problem is.
We should have condoms on campus even if AIDS had never come upon us. We should have condoms on campus because people are more frisky than Doug would like them to be, because he can't follow them around and make them behave in the way
this friskiness,
this married man
what
behaves.
you call friskiness is costing an awful lot of lives.
Well, okay, now you're fine with that. You talk about that people have to learn to accept the consequences. The consequences of fooling around heterosexually are not death. The consequences for you of fooling around are not pregnancy. That's pretty draconian consequences for something not quite akin to murder.
But you're in a
you believe in the death penalty, for God's sake,
well, that's
for homosexual relations, is that right?
Well, yeah.
You mentioned something about the Bible here recently, supporting being disrespectful to your parents, that Jesus isn't meek and mild, that being disrespectful to your parents is something somebody should be snuffed for. Do you really believe that?
Look, what you are doing is arguing long and loudly against the way life is.
Nothing changed the West faster than the railroad. In the late 1800s, an anvil chorus echoed across the plains. Civilization steamed over everything in its way, including the Indian. But the spirit of the untamed land still lives in the West of the imagination.
Tonight at 10 here on Northwest Public Television.
You're watching Northwest Public Television, KWSU Pullman, and KTNW Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick.
Good evening, and welcome to Counterpoint for Thursday, February 11th. This is the program that brings together a couple of people you know. Bill Hall, the editorial page editor for the Lewiston Morning Tribune and columnist with that newspaper, who generally represents the liberal point of view. And on the conservative side, Doug Wilson, a Moscow minister and also a columnist for the Lewiston Morning Tribune. And I'm Glenn Johnson. We'll go to the grab bag of current topics in just a few minutes. But first of all, here's an opinion piece by Doug Wilson.
The way I see it, liberals have got to stop helping Pat Robertson. The only way Mr. Robertson is going to get anywhere in the Republican Party is through an appeal to that party's conservatives. He has so far been far more successful in this than pundits anticipated. So what do the liberals do about this? They protest in the shrillest possible tones those positions of Mr. Robertson that most movement conservatives share. An example of this would be the heat Pat Robertson took for mentioning the racist origins of Planned Parenthood. The liberal response was typical: all indignation and no refutation. Here, Pat Robertson knew what he was talking about. Conservatives need not support Pat Robertson. I do not. But it baffles me why liberals are trying to increase his conservative support. The Republican Party is conservative. Pat Robertson, therefore, wants to assume the mantle of Ronald Reagan. When he is attacked by the liberal establishment because of his mainstream conservative positions, he is only helped, and that by liberals. Liberals really ought to change their tactics, but that would involve some homework and research on the real meaning of conservatism, and that would interfere with our prejudices, wouldn't it, Bill?
Well, I don't think I can ever be accused of having accused the Reverend of being a mainstream conservative, but I understand your point. Candidates do tend to get more attention if they're a little bit more in left or right field, and he does a better job at serving as a lightning rod for the press in that respect than anybody I've ever seen.
No, that's not my point. The point is not that he attracts lightning from the press. The point is he attracts lightning from the press for those positions which are really mainstream conservative positions. They're not objectionable to conservatives at all. There are some things that he could be taken to task for which he has not been taken to task for, and the things that he gets it for are things that you have conservatives out there scratching their heads saying, well, why is everybody excited about that?
I've never considered praying for the end of a hurricane a mainstream conservative position, but he is kind of a clever little Dickens when it comes to finding ways to get the attention of the press through attack or otherwise, and that's part of what the presidential game is about, is to stand out in a crowd. But sometimes I think he stands out a little bit more than even he would like.
No, when you're talking about him, let's say, healing the lady in the yellow Volkswagen on an old 700 Club thing, that's the sort of thing that strikes some people as erratic. Right? Why, is this really a man we want to have running for president or occupying that office? But when he says that Planned Parenthood was racist in its origin, and your paper attacks that as a wacko position, he's in the know and your paper was not.
It's not only a wacko position, but it's unfair. Everyone of Margaret Sanger's age, Abraham Lincoln was a racist by present definition, but to charge that today's...
Margaret Sanger could have been a speechwriter for Adolf.
Yes, and so could George Washington. But to dredge up ancient history and rub the nose of a respectable, serious, multiracial organization today is a dirty trick. You know, we could do the same thing with his Baptist church.
Wait a second.
Am I getting more like him all the time?
The problem is this.
I can't say Baptist church without doing a slight imitation of
Baptist
Robertson.
has a P in it. No, it's not Baptist, it's Baptist. Anyway, the point is, if you take, let's say you attack Planned Parenthood for its racist origin, if a contemporary spokesman...
How about for its racist, current racist views?
Wait a second. If a spokesman for Planned Parenthood said, yes, Margaret Sanger had some fruitcake views about race, and she was a racist, and yes, she was the founder of Planned Parenthood, Pat Robertson got that exactly right, but we don't stand for that anymore, everybody would say, well, what's Pat Robertson talking about this for? But when they huff and puff and say that's not true, and everybody knows that it was true, it is true, then it looks like they've got something to hide.
He says he is against Planned Parenthood because of ancient history. That's not true. He's against Planned Parenthood because of what it believes today. Well, he disagrees with it on abortion, and this other stuff is just mudslinging.
Well, there are plenty.
There
are plenty of things to disagree with in Planned Parenthood, both ancient and modern. The modern objections, you could rename it Planned Parenthood or Banned Parenthood, whatever you want.
I was interested to see that he did indicate he supports some forms of birth control.
Oh, Bill, it's time now for your commentary.
I have a warning for America. If we don't make condoms available to the wicked young folk on our nation's campuses, then they will know that they will get AIDS, pregnant, or both. Consequently, nearly all of the wicked young folk will mend their ways and start staying out of each other's shorts. And the few who don't will die or have babies, which is a just punishment in both cases for their unsuitable behavior. Similarly, If we take flak jackets, helmets, and armored vehicles away from armies, nearly all of them will lose the appetite for war. And if we outlaw seat belts, drivers will be forced to stop speeding. After all, a seat belt is just a substitute for the kind of ethical behavior that drivers should be practicing. And if you permit seat belts, you will be encouraging people to delude themselves that they are safe doing the sort of thing they shouldn't be doing. Oh, sure, some apologists for immorality behind the wheel will try to tell you that people are going to speed anyway, so you might as well let the little dickens have their seat belts. But after all, how effective are seat belts anyway? A seat belt is merely a Band-Aid on a gaping moral wound in a society that needs instead to come to grips with the ethical failure of risking your own life and that of others by traveling at morally repugnant rates of speed. And to say, as some do, that speeding is just another lifestyle is akin to saying that homosexuality is just another way to get a date on a Saturday night. Let's do away with condoms, with armored vehicles, with seat belts, and we will surely do away with illicit sex, with war, and with speeding as well. And remember, he who drives too fast to a sexual encounter that causes a war is truly an abomination. Doug?
Speaking of abominations, that piece was a logical monstrosity. Do you really mean to tell me that because it is illegitimate to take preventative measures for an illegitimate activity, it is therefore illegitimate to take preventative safety measures for a legitimate activity?
Speeding is not a legitimate...
Right, wrong, these are strange concepts.
Speeding is not a legitimate activity.
Is driving a legitimate activity?
Yes, driving...
Could you ever use a seatbelt and be in need of a seatbelt without ever breaking the law?
Could you ever be in need of a seatbelt
without... Suppose the other fellow's breaking the law. Suppose you lose control but you weren't speeding. Suppose any number of things. The seatbelt is a preventative safety device not designed to subsidize the breaking of the law. It's simply designed to protect people's lives in a legitimate activity.
Similarly,
driving.
In marriage, condoms have a legitimate purpose.
So who's talking about condoms in marriage? We're not. We're talking about condoms on university